before the sword glinted in the morning light, before the crowd gathered to see England's most infamous queen fall, Anne Boleyn's enemies made sure her death would not be swift mercy, but a slow, exquisite ruin. They didn't want her merely executed. They wanted her annihilated, her name, her dignity, her very soul. What they did before that blade ever touched her neck was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Forget the coronation jewels and the velvet robes that once marked her as Henry VIII's chosen queen. Our story begins in the grey, damp heart of the Tower of London, the very place where she had once been celebrated, now turned into her tomb in waiting. It was May of 1536. The air inside the tower was thick with the smell of moss and wet stone. Anne was 35 years old, accused of adultery, treason, and incest. Crimes so grotesque, so theatrical, that even her enemies must have known they were absurd. But in Tudor England, absurdity could still kill you. She had been queen for barely 3 years. Once the dazzling woman who defied a king, broke a church, and crowned herself with scandal, she now sat on a narrow bed of straw. Her world had shrunk to 4 cold walls, guarded day and night by men who were not permitted to speak to her except to deliver commands. Her maid, the faithful Ellen, was her only whisper of comfort. The same court that had once cheered her was now baying for her blood. The nobles she had laughed with at banquets now conspired against her. Even her own uncle, the powerful Duke of Norfolk, presided over her trial. The message was clear. Anne Boleyn was to be erased, but she wasn't ready to disappear quietly. In the days leading to her trial, she demanded writing materials and spent hours crafting letters to Henry, to her brother, to anyone who might still hold a spark of mercy. Never prince had wife more loyal in all duty and in all true affection than you have ever found in Anne Boleyn, she wrote. It was both a plea and a curse, because loyalty had been her downfall. From the moment her arrest was ordered, the cruelty was staged like theatre. On May 2nd, she was summoned to the Privy Chamber, where Thomas Cromwell, the king's ruthless minister, read out her charges. They accused her of seducing 5 men, including her own brother, George. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Anne, with the same wit that had once bewitched a monarch, lifted her chin and said, "If any man accuses me, I will confront him face to face." Her defiance wasn't a performance. It was survival. But defiance, in the eyes of her enemies, was insolence. The next morning, the guards came for her. The streets of London, once filled with cheers for Anne the Radiant, now echoed with whispers of Anne the Whore. She was paraded through the gates of the Tower in a barge on the Thames, the same path she had taken 3 years earlier on the day of her coronation. Except now, the trumpets were silent and the crowds turned away. In her cell, she was denied rest, denied privacy, denied dignity. 2 women, planted by Cromwell, were assigned to watch her day and night and report her every word. When she prayed, they listened. When she cried, they took note. When she laughed, a brittle, hysterical sound. They whispered that she was mad. Every moment of her existence became evidence against her. Anne's trial was a masterpiece of manipulation. The court was packed with nobles eager to see her fall. Henry, safely absent, waited for the verdict that had already been written. The accused men, poets, courtiers, friends, had been tortured or bribed into confession. Her brother George, who refused to admit guilt, was condemned anyway. When Anne was brought before the peers of England, she wore a plain black gown and a French hood. Her face was pale, but her posture was unbroken. "My lords," she began, her voice clear, "I am clear of all offense toward the king." The gallery murmured. Even her enemies couldn't deny her composure, but it didn't matter. Norfolk's cold voice pronounced her guilty. The sentence was death, by burning or beheading, at the king's pleasure. Henry chose the latter, calling it an act of mercy. In the days that followed, Anne's mind began to flicker between faith and fear. Witnesses described her pacing her cell, murmuring prayers, then suddenly laughing, saying she would be remembered as a queen. She asked her ladies to bring her a little book of hours, its pages worn soft from use. There, between its prayers, she hid a small lock of her daughter's golden hair. Elizabeth, the child she would never see again. Each dawn in the tower brought fresh humiliation. One morning she asked a guard what day it was. "Friday, madam," he said. "And tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "Saturday." "Then I shall not die till Monday," she whispered, as if reassuring herself that she still had time to breathe, to think, to pray. But time was a cruelty in itself. When news reached her that her brother and the other men had been executed, she fell to her knees, her composure cracking at last. "Oh, my poor brother," she wept. "He was so kind to me." Yet even in that grief, there was something terrifyingly regal in her posture. She was still Anne Boleyn, the woman who had brought kings to their knees. On the morning of May 18th, the lieutenant of the tower entered her chamber. The French executioner had been summoned. Anne thanked him for his kindness, and in one of the strangest moments of calm ever recorded, told him she was glad the executioner was from France. "For I have heard he is very good, and I have a little neck." Then she laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound that silenced the room. She dressed herself deliberately that morning in a gown of deep gray damask and a crimson kirtle beneath, her colors chosen with care. The gray for repentance, the red for the blood she knew she would soon shed. When she looked at herself in the small shard of mirror she was allowed, she whispered, "Jesu, receive my soul." As the sun rose over the tower that morning, a pale gold light filtered through the narrow slits of her cell. The air smelled of rain and ash. From the courtyard came the muffled sound of carpenters hammering wood. The scaffold was being assembled. Every blow echoed like a drumbeat of fate. Anne listened, motionless, her hands clasped before her. Her ladies sobbed quietly, but Anne did not cry. "Peace," she told them softly. "For I heard say the executioner is very skillful, and my neck is but little." Her calm terrified them more than hysteria ever could. The cruelty of her final hours was meticulous, crafted to humiliate her as completely as possible. Where once she had commanded a court that bowed to her will, now every movement was dictated by others. Her request for confession was delayed for hours. Her priest, John Skip, wept as he gave her the sacrament. "I am ready to meet my death," she told him, "and I thank God that I am prepared." There was no trace of bitterness, only an eerie serenity that unsettled everyone around her. The king had ordered that she die by the sword, not the axe, a gesture meant to sound merciful but calculated for spectacle. The executioner had been brought from Calais days earlier, and word spread quickly through London. Crowds began gathering at dawn, curious, hungry for the theater of a queen's fall. The streets around the tower swelled with merchants, fishwives, and nobles, all jostling for a glimpse. For the people, it was not just an execution, it was a reckoning. Inside, Anne made her final preparations. She distributed the few possessions she still had among her attendants: a prayer book, a rosary, a handkerchief embroidered with the letter A to her loyal servant. She gave a ring. "Pray for me," she said, "and remember me when you look upon this." Her voice did not tremble. Shortly after 8 o'clock, Sir William Kingston, the lieutenant of the tower, entered to tell her the time had come. The words hung in the air. Anne rose slowly, straightened her gown, and smoothed the linen of her coif. "I will not say much," she murmured, "for I am not afraid." Then she turned to her maids and smiled, that same enigmatic smile that had once conquered a king. The walk from her cell to the scaffold was brief, but it must have felt endless. The courtyard was hushed, filled with hundreds of eyes. Witnesses later said they could hear the sound of her skirts brushing the wood. She moved with an almost supernatural composure. The wind caught the edges of her veil, fluttering it like a banner. When she reached the steps, she paused and looked out at the sea of faces: nobles, soldiers, servants, commoners. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered a prayer. Anne bowed her head slightly, as if in acknowledgement. Then she began to speak. "Good Christian people," she said clearly, "I am come hither to die according to law, for by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I pray and beseech you all to pray for the King's grace, for he is a good, gentle, and sovereign Lord." The words were perfect. They carried no accusation, no bitterness, just a calm surrender that made even her enemies uneasy. It was the ultimate act of defiance, to forgive the man who had condemned her. In that moment, she was no longer the villain Henry's court had painted her to be. She was something greater, something terrifying in her grace. As she knelt on the straw-covered boards, her ladies rushed forward, weeping. They tied a blindfold across her eyes, and Anne whispered a final prayer. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." She repeated the words again and again, her voice growing quieter. The French executioner stepped forward, sword in hand. He had removed his shoes so that his approach would be silent. Anne, blindfolded, waited, her neck bent slightly forward. She believed he was still preparing his weapon. "Bring me my sword," he called suddenly. A ruse. As she turned her head instinctively, the blade flashed once through the air. It was over in a heartbeat. But that was not the end of her story. Not even close. The days leading up to her death had been a masterclass in psychological warfare. What the court had done to her, the whispered rumors, the isolation, the false kindnesses, had been designed not just to kill her, but to make her die a monster in the eyes of the people. After the execution, the crowd's reaction was strangely muted. Some crossed themselves, others murmured, "God save her soul." The headsman held up her severed head by the dark strands of her hair, the same hair Henry had once called raven silk. Blood dripped onto the boards. For a brief moment, the crowd was utterly still. Then the body of the former queen was placed hastily into a rough elm chest that had once held arrows. No coffin, no ceremony. In the days that followed Anne Boleyn's execution, the air in London felt heavy, as if the city itself recoiled from what it had witnessed. The crowds had dispersed, the scaffold dismantled, the blood washed away. But her absence seemed to hum beneath the surface. At the Tower, her maids were dismissed without ceremony. Her few remaining possessions were seized and catalogued as though she were a criminal and not a queen. In Henry's palace, meanwhile, the celebration had already begun. On the very morning after her death, the king donned white, the color of joy and purity, and rode out to meet Jane Seymour. He was seen laughing, carefree, the execution already a fading shadow. To the courtiers who watched, it was a shocking display. Yet few dared to show it. They had learned too well that sympathy for the dead could be mistaken for disloyalty to the living. Still, behind the silks and banquets, a quiet dread took root. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne's downfall, was lauded as the king's savior. For now. But those who knew the king's temper also knew that power under Henry VIII was a death sentence waiting to be signed. Cromwell's victory felt hollow, haunted by whispers. Servants spoke of strange sounds in the Tower, of footsteps in the Queen's lodgings when no one was there, of a woman's faint laughter echoing through the corridors. Superstition spread quickly in Tudor England. They said Anne's spirit refused to rest. Guards swore they had seen a pale figure walking the Tower Green at night, carrying her head in her hands. Some claimed the horses in the royal stables would rear and whinny at unseen shadows. The executioner himself, brought from Calais for his skill, returned home soon after and fell into silence. He never took another royal commission. It was said he was troubled by dreams of a woman in grey who stared at him with eyes full of forgiveness. But it wasn't only the superstitious who felt her presence. Even Henry seemed unable to escape her ghost. In his private letters, a flicker of unease surfaced, a need to justify, to reframe, to convince himself of the righteousness of what he'd done. She was found guilty by law, he wrote to a foreign ambassador, and I am at peace. Yet the speed with which he remarried betrayed the opposite. It was not peace, it was denial. Anne's daughter, the infant Princess Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate within hours of her mother's death. Her status, once royal, was reduced to that of lady. She was sent away to live in the countryside under the care of distant relatives. Few could have imagined that this forgotten child would one day reign as one of England's greatest monarchs. But history has a strange way of avenging the silenced. For those who had betrayed Anne, the consequences were slow but sure. Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, the men accused with her, were all executed days before her own death, but their families never recovered. Cromwell himself, the mastermind, would eventually fall from favor. Just 4 years later, he too would kneel at the scaffold. Some said it was Anne's curse, others divine justice. But when the blade fell on Cromwell, the crowd's roar was eerily familiar. Within the court, Anne's name became forbidden. The chroniclers of the time wrote her story in cautious tones, careful not to provoke the king's wrath. Yet beneath that silence, her legend began to grow. In whispers and ballads, she was transformed into something greater than the flesh and blood woman she had been. A martyr of ambition, a victim of love turned to tyranny, a warning and a prophecy. There was a peculiar irony in her legacy. The very thing Henry had sought to destroy, her influence, became immortal. Her enemies had stripped her of everything, yet she remained the mother of the New England they had created. The Reformation, which had begun with her rise, could not be undone. The church Henry tore apart to have her became the foundation of Elizabeth's empire. Those who had watched her die found themselves haunted not just by her memory, but by her words. "I am clear of all offense toward the king," she had said before her death. "May he long rule." It was a statement that could be read as humble submission or cutting irony. Years later, when Elizabeth ascended the throne, that sentence would ring like prophecy. Even as the decades passed, Anne's story continued to ripple through England's consciousness. Artists and poets painted her not as a sinner, but as a tragic heroine. The Tower of London itself became inseparable from her ghost. Every year on the anniversary of her death, flowers appeared mysteriously on the spot where she had been executed. No one ever saw who left them, but perhaps the most haunting consequence of all was the way Anne changed the image of queenship itself. Before her, a queen was meant to be silent, submissive, a vessel for heirs and alliances. Anne defied that. She spoke her mind. She argued with her husband. She believed she could shape destiny. And for a brief, dazzling moment, she did. That defiance became her undoing, but it also became her legacy. Henry VIII would go on to marry 4 more times, each union more cursed than the last. None of those women inspired the same fire, the same hatred, the same fascination that Anne had. And though history books would try to reduce her to scandal, her name endured longer than any of his wives. There is an account, perhaps apocryphal, that years after Anne's death, Henry visited the tower and paused near the chapel where she lay buried. The guards saw him stand there in silence for a long time, staring at the stones beneath his feet. When asked what he was thinking, he reportedly said, "She would have borne me sons had I been kinder." Then he turned away, his face unreadable. It's impossible to know if that story is true, but it captures something essential, that beneath the king's power and rage, there lingered a wound that no crown could cover. Anne Boleyn had been more than his wife. She had been his mirror, the reflection of his own ambition, his hunger, his ruin. And mirrors, once broken, always leave shards behind. When the infant Elizabeth was banished from court, few paid her any mind. To the courtiers who bowed to the new queen, Jane Seymour, she was merely the ghost of a fallen mother. But as she grew, those who knew her began to whisper that there was something uncanny in her gaze. The sharpness of her eyes, the regal tilt of her chin. It was as though Anne had returned in another form. Henry rarely saw his daughter. When he did, he called her "my daughter Elizabeth," never the princess. Yet he could not bring himself to look at her for long. She reminded him too much of what he had destroyed. Elizabeth's tutors wrote of her brilliance, her wit, her hunger for knowledge. Those who had known Anne said she had been the same. A woman too clever for her time, too bold for a world that demanded silence from its queens. As the years passed and the fires of the Reformation burned through England, Anne's name began to take on a strange dual life. To the devout Catholics, she remained the serpent who had led Henry into sin, the temptress who had lured a king from his wife and the church. But to others, especially to women who whispered stories behind closed doors, she became a symbol of courage, a woman who had dared to stand beside power, not beneath it. When Henry died in 1547, the court that had condemned Anne seemed to crumble with him. The men who had engineered her fall, Norfolk, Cromwell, and the rest, were either dead or disgraced. The daughter they had sought to erase was 17. In her quiet exile, Elizabeth learned a lesson her mother had paid for in blood: that survival was an art, and that words could be deadlier than swords. Years later, when she finally took the throne, the transformation was complete. The bastard child of the executed queen became Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the unchallenged ruler of England. When she entered the great hall for her coronation, witnesses said the crowd gasped. Her gown shimmered in white and gold, but it wasn't her attire that stunned them. It was her face, the unmistakable echo of Anne Boleyn. The daughter now stood where her mother had fallen. Elizabeth never spoke publicly of Anne, but her actions said enough. She restored the dignity of her mother's name, quietly reburied the rumors under the weight of her reign. She kept portraits of Anne in her private chambers, where only her closest attendants could see them. One ambassador, writing in secret, noted that the Queen seems to revere the memory of the mother whom others revile. It was as though Anne's story had not ended at the scaffold, but had continued through her daughter's veins, reborn in every act of defiance and brilliance that defined Elizabeth's rule. The same courage that had once carried Anne to the throne now guided her child to remake an empire. But even as Elizabeth reigned, Anne's ghost remained restless. Travelers to the tower claimed that on certain nights in May, a figure in grey could be seen kneeling near the chapel where she was buried. Others said they had seen her drifting through the corridors, her head cradled in her arms, her lips moving in silent prayer. The guards who patrolled those grounds often refused to walk there after dark. Stories multiplied. During Elizabeth's reign, a visiting Spanish envoy recorded that he had heard the unquiet spirit of the late queen haunting the Tower Green, her sighs rising like the wind. In later centuries, soldiers stationed there would swear they saw her, her form glowing faintly beneath the moonlight, and though skeptics dismissed it as superstition, the tales endured. Not because people feared her, but because they pitied her. Anne's ghost, they said, was not vengeful. She did not cry out for retribution. Instead, she walked as a warning, a silent reminder of how power devours its own. Every monarch who followed, from Elizabeth to the Stuarts, from the Hanoverians to the Windsors, carried her story like an invisible scar across the English crown. Historians would later try to strip the myths away, to find the real Anne beneath centuries of legend. But what they found was something even more compelling. Letters written by those who knew her paint a picture not of a schemer, but of a woman of fierce conviction, intelligent, devout, and capable of extraordinary charm. She was neither saint nor sinner, but something far more human. That humanity, perhaps, was what the world could never forgive her for. In time, the narrative shifted. Poets like Thomas Wyatt, who had once loved her, wrote mournful verses about a woman who tamed the lion. Artists painted her not as a temptress, but as a tragic muse. By the 18th century, Anne Boleyn had become one of England's most enduring obsessions. Her story was retold in plays, poems, and eventually books, each generation finding something new in her fall. And still, the fascination persisted because Anne embodied something universal, the peril of standing too close to power. Her beauty, her wit, her ambition, all the qualities that made her irresistible to Henry, were the very traits that doomed her. In destroying her, the king had revealed not her weakness, but his own. Centuries after her death, Anne Boleyn became not just a historical figure, but a mirror through which England examined itself. Its hunger for spectacle, its cruelty, its contradictions. The same nation that had cheered her death would later mourn her, would dress her image in pearls and reverence. In some strange way, England could not let her go because she represented everything it feared and desired in equal measure: love, rebellion, faith, ruin. Today, if you stand in the Tower of London at dawn, the air still seems to hum with her name. Guides tell visitors that sometimes, on quiet mornings, you can hear the faint sound of footsteps pacing on the grass. Steady, graceful, unhurried. They say she always stops before the chapel door, turns as though to face the crowd that once watched her die, and then vanishes into the mist. It's a story that defies time. Anne Boleyn was meant to be forgotten, erased, buried without trace. Yet nearly 5 centuries later, her ghost still walks, not just in the tower, but through history itself. Centuries after that fateful May morning, Anne Boleyn is no longer just the queen who lost her head. She has become something far more enduring, a symbol of resilience, rebellion, and the quiet strength that refuses to be erased. The woman who once stood alone on the scaffold is now studied, painted, filmed, and immortalized in every retelling of Tudor history. Yet every version, from reverent to scandalous, seems to circle the same truth. They tried to destroy her, and instead, they made her eternal. Over the centuries, historians dug through the lies that had shrouded her name. The records of her trial, once read as proof of guilt, were revealed to be theater, not justice. The confessions extracted by Cromwell's men were exposed as coerced, the accusations of incest and adultery as political tools wielded by men desperate to please their king. In the cold light of history, Anne Boleyn's so-called crimes vanished, leaving behind only the outline of a woman too ambitious for her age and too visible for her own safety. What made her dangerous was never her sin, but her mind. She was one of the few women of her era educated in philosophy, literature, and theology. She spoke French fluently, debated religion with scholars, and dared to challenge the king, not with seduction, but with intellect. That, more than anything, sealed her fate. The court could forgive beauty, it could even forgive pride, but it could not forgive a woman who thought for herself. Modern scholars call Anne the architect of her own myth. Her rise from lady-in-waiting to queen reshaped England's destiny. It sparked the English Reformation, tore down centuries of papal power, and redefined the monarchy itself. Yet it also revealed the cost of stepping into the spotlight of history. Once there, you could no longer control how you were seen. Even now, 500 years later, people argue about who she really was. Was she a cunning opportunist or a visionary reformer? A tragic heroine or an ambitious manipulator? The truth, as always, lies somewhere between. Perhaps that's what makes her story so magnetic. The fact that she resists being simplified. In recent decades, the world has begun to see Anne differently. Biographers have reclaimed her as a feminist icon before her time. A woman navigating a system designed to silence her. Her intelligence and conviction, once painted as arrogance, are now seen as survival. Her refusal to bow, even in her final hour, is recognized for what it was, not vanity, but courage, and the irony is impossible to ignore. The dynasty Henry built on her ruin would be ruled by her daughter, the child he had cast aside. Under Elizabeth, England became a global power, its golden age defined by art, exploration, and strength. The same kingdom that had condemned Anne for ambition would one day celebrate those same qualities in her child. It was as if Anne's ghost had guided Elizabeth's hand, whispering from the shadows, "Do not bend, do not break." The image of Anne that survives today, the sharp eyes, the enigmatic half-smile, the black pearl necklace at her throat, is not just a relic, it's a challenge. She stares across centuries, daring us to reconsider what it means to be remembered, to ask who writes history and whose voices it buries. Because for all the pomp and blood of her execution, Anne Boleyn's greatest victory was this: she outlived them all. Her story continues to rise from the ashes of propaganda and rumor, more alive with each retelling. The courtiers who condemned her, the king who destroyed her, their names fade in comparison. But Anne remains. Even the tower itself seems to bear her memory. The chapel where she was buried, once unmarked, now bears her name. Tourists file through the narrow archways every day, whispering prayers or laying flowers where her body rests beneath the stone floor. Some say they can still feel it. That strange, unearthly calm that witnesses spoke of on the morning she died. It's as if the walls remember, and perhaps they do. Because Anne Boleyn's story isn't just about a queen's fall, it's about the price of being seen. About what happens when a woman's ambition collides with a man's fear. It's about the difference between silence and survival. She was not perfect, not pure, not saintly. She was flawed, brilliant, human, and in the end, that humanity is what saved her legacy. Before the sword fell, Anne faced her death with an unshakable grace that no blade could cut through. She forgave her executioner, prayed for the king, and met her end with words of peace. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," she said. That was her final defiance. Not anger, not vengeance, but serenity. They took her crown, they took her name, they took her life, but they could never take her story. And maybe that's the greatest revenge of all. Even now, as night falls over the tower and the wind hums through its ancient stones, her spirit lingers. Not as a ghost of sorrow, but as a whisper of strength. A reminder that history can burn your body, but it can never kill your voice. Thank you for watching. If you believe stories like Anne Boleyn's deserve to be told, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and join us for more untold chapters of history. Because behind every crown, every legend, every silence, there's always another truth waiting to be found.